Good morning. Let me add my thanks to the one I heard before. Thanks for the invitation, Jean-Louis Cohen, of course, our chair today. I also wish to thank Anna and Susan for the collaboration and all the technicians, because I think that's how we make our conference successful. What's happened? Ah, it's me. I have shown this short sequence from Rossellini's Roma città aperta to give an impression of the impact of the war on life in Italy, on the home front and on the battlefront in the winter of 1943-44. A short detail, the conversation at the end between Pina and Francesco. Francesco says the spring will be even better because we will be free. Bizarre, the translation says we will be husband and wife. And I'm wondering what's there behind. Anyhow, let me give Cold War, Catholic Church, who knows? Let me give you some background. Since June 10th, 1940, when Mussolini declared war on Britain and France, Italian opinion about the results fluctuated widely, changing in time from a timid optimism to a full awareness of the inevitability of the defeat. The conflict that Il Duce thought would end soon and not require much fighting became in time a tragic series of disasters. On July 25th, 1943, the Grand Council of Fascists deposed Mussolini. There is always a misunderstanding about when Mussolini, and the end was. From then onwards, the mood shifted dramatically. The population itself, without any hope for victory, began to assist in the fall of the regime. As the hostilities intensified, the collective support for the war diminished significantly, and the resistance movement gained notable force as the plot, I'm not going to give you the plot, of the Open City reveals. June 4th, 1944, marked a successful Allied advance into Rome, freeing the capital from German control. Yet, the country had to wait for almost another year for the final defeat of the Nazis' occupation army and the liberation. On April 25th, 1945, Turin and Milan were liberated. This paper examines both official government and popular, more private responses to the demands of the war years. I would like to propose that both of these responses might be seen as performing a kind of masquerade. This masquerade, or masking, has two meanings: to mask in order to protect, for example, war camouflage, an aspect I shall soon touch briefly, and to mask reality, extending from everyday practices to intentional propaganda, a strategy that fascism undertook with real mastery. An example of the official response are the propaganda pamphlets of the early 40s, which were intended to recast the massosphere into some sort of fabricated consensus of support. These pamphlets were seemingly oblivious of the reverses of Italy's forces abroad, to the intense aerial bombardments of the cities, to the hunger and alarm suffered by the soldiers on the front lines and by civilians' population at the home front. There is no question that architecture also contributed to this official masquerade. Confronting the ostensible mask of the public scenario, however, is also a more private mask that involved architecture. The hopes and wishes of the architects were often embodied in the intimacy of their vision of future dwellings and ways of living. This dreamed-of transformation of domestic life was one of the few subjects that they embraced in preparation for peacetime reconstruction. My aim is to offer some preliminary thoughts about this largely unwritten history as suggested in the conference brief. Today's contribution is based primarily on visual materials. Movies, you have seen an example, and newsreel coming on one side, and those architectural magazines that contributed to operate from 1937 to 1945 on the other side. On red, you see some of the brackets of the operation of these magazines. One glimpse of this unwritten history can be seen in Domus. You don't see the cover here. The magazine that Joe Ponti founded in 1928, the same year when Marangoni's La Casa Bella was also started. Working on this paper, I was more and more confronted with the intellectual engagement of Ponti's magazine, which in the late 30s had abandoned the cliché of the ladies' journal. In these years, Domus played a pivotal role in generating debate in architectural circles, maintaining a position quite distant from the stringent involvement in regime politics of Piacentini architettura, or even at a certain degree of Pagano's Casa Bella. Ponti felt it was imperative to initiate a new discourse on the art of dwelling, and his strong moral stand would encourage his younger colleagues to go beyond the elitist or official agendas and to explore the most fundamental sense, the house of man. An important example of this is Ponti's close relationship with Giuseppe Pagano, whose utopian vision of the so-called the Casa a Collina, the fulcrum of Vaccaro's ideal city, interesting images, was given full recognition and support in the pages of Domus. This is 1937. Another example is Ponti's immersion in Mediterranean ideals, exemplified during this period by his intellectual friendship with Bernard Rudowski. But at the end of 1940, Ponti left Domus and founded Stile, another source for understanding the cultural anxiety architects suffered in the war years. It is no surprise to read in a March issue of Stile, 1941, it's number 3, the message the fascist Minister of Education, Giuseppe Bottai, addressed to the readers of the magazine before he went to join the front in North Africa. Bottai was one of the apostles of the cooperative state and advocated architecture as state art. Yet, when the conflict began, architects showed no hesitation to escape that diktat. Bottai used words intended to re-establish architecture at the center of the practice instead of ideology. He opened his message in Stile as follows, I quote, "Architecture is civilization. The war calls architecture back to its reason for being, that is, morality. Architecture must embody the highest culture of everybody's life," end quote. Though Domus no longer had Ponti at his helm, he went to Stile, the magazine never lost its soul, addressing subjects whose richness in design thinking have never been fully explored. New ideas about home and living style can be seen in the projects conceived under the title La Casa e l'Ideale, which I will discuss in the second part of this paper. A final consideration about historical time frame of this narrative may help to clarify this chapter of the still unwritten history about Italian architecture, 3649. Manfredo Tafuri was certainly aware of the void between the fiasco of the E42 plan and competition and the end of World War II. The former, the E42, marks the conclusion of Giorgio Ciucci's book Gli architetti e il fascismo, the immediate precedent to Tafuri's Storia dell'architettura italiana of 1982. The chronological bracket 4485 Tafuri proposed in the title of his book is worth considering. The year 1944 is the one that interests me, of course. Tafuri had overcome the myth of the liberation, the famous mythical year 1945, and suggested another beginning to democratic Italy. Tafuri's history was resistance-oriented. Therefore, he opened his first chapter in this book, Architecture Before the Reconstruction, with an emphasis on memorial architecture as an homage to the ideas of those who, during the preceding 2 decades, were forced to retreat into themselves. One of the 2 monuments he cites is that of the Fosse Ardeatine in Rome. The Fosse Ardeatine mass execution, carried out in Rome on March 24th, 1944, by German occupation troops, preceded the liberation of the capital of just few months, June, March. Soon after the massacre, a competition was held to build a memorial cemetery on the site of the Fosse Ardeatine. As Tafuri suggests, it can be viewed as the first competition of a new democratic Italy. Therefore, the year 1944 truly marked a new dawn. If culturally one can see the end date preceding the actual conclusion of World War II in 1944, likewise, the rise of a cultural change can be seen as preceding its beginning in 1940. The fascist politics after the capture of the Addis Ababa and the proclamation of the empire in early May 1936, as well as the opportunistic intention of Mussolini that partially led him to enter the war, allows us to read the 4 years between 1936 and 1940 as a clear anticipation of the war. One of the first and clearest indications of this shift came from the League of Nations sanctions imposed after Ethiopia's invasion. They resulted in rise of the autarky that characterized the fascist economy and eventually became a steady component of the financial system of the regime in the second half of the 1930s. Here I'm giving a different reading, the one we heard yesterday. Based on the drastic reduction of the imports, the autarky served as a gear to operate in a regime of economic self-sufficiency. It soon became apparent that it was a short and adverse chimera, one that resulted in strong counter-moves from by foreign countries and, in general, discontent of a population deprived of goods that had previously been imported. Furthermore, by the end of the decade, the demands of the world industry had curtailed individual consumption itself, reducing it to a minimum of subsistence. This atmosphere of suspensions, right before the beginning of the total war, was captured masterly in a series of black and white pictures Alberto Lattuada started taking around 1938 in the outskirts of his native Milano. At the end, Alberto, who later became a well-renowned film director, also of the neorealism, had just graduated from the School of Architecture at the Politecnico and had begun to collaborate with the magazine Domus. His images show a realism that anticipates the cinematographic neorealism. Lattuada's square eye, I'm borrowing the title of his book, published with these pictures in 1941, expressed the normality of this existence, what can be called a degree zero realism, without any indulgence in forms or in interplay of light and shadow. At the center of his reportage are human beings imprisoned in the impoverished materiality of their everyday existence. Lattuada displayed the inadequacy of people and living conditions to provide an effective reaction to any kind of mobilization for war. This proved to be the truth only in the Milanese hinterland. The same normality might have been seen throughout the country. The gap between politics and people, between official imagery and daily life, was irreconcilable. Now, I return again to the official imagery. In 1938, the Minister of War issued 11 booklets to supply local authorities with instruction on air raid protection. Produced under the supervision of the civil engineers of the Genio Militare, this material were intended to clarify and make official Italian defense duties as the possibility of the war increased. These booklets deal specifically with the organization and management of civilian defense, including instruction about sound air sirens, blackout, public air raid shelters, camouflage of targets, evacuation from bomb-damaged properties and new accommodation, sanitary protection, fire protection. Yet, no air raid warden service was ever created as it happened outside Italy, for instance, in Great Britain. Well, I'm not going into detail, town planning and shelters. What I wish to say that with most operations still improvised, following the native arte di arrangiarsi of the Italians, the instruction remained mostly on paper. However, there were a few isolated examples of good care of the cultural heritage, specifically in the safeguard of monuments and artworks. And I think that at this point we can make an interesting connection with the list we heard yesterday, the protection of cultural heritage, and the next, one of the newsreel. Arapacis, Galleria Borghese, and the famous Marco Aurelio. It means that the restoration was the second time was moved. Well, interesting. Next, I would like to address briefly the issue of masking in defense camouflage. One of the aspects that is so striking is the role that cultural values, namely the value of the antique in fascism and nationalism, had in proposal for the defense of basic infrastructure. In the images on your left, two fake arches are intended to simulate the remains of an ancient aqueduct, with the construction disguising the pure support of a cableway. We are in Tuscany near Mining. Was the camouflage intended to impress the hostile pilot? Did the official proposing this strategy really believe that a foreign pilot would recognize and value the architecture of the antiquity? The antiquity holds here almost a kind of apotropaic status. And was the small countryside church erected as camouflage of a water purifying station meant to appeal to a religious sentiment of the enemy and thus become a tool of defense? The The war propaganda served better than any physical protection to keep Italy safe. At least that is what the regime seemed to be saying to the Italian people. This is really the beginning, the propaganda. It was extremely pervasive. Architectural magazines also participate in this propaganda campaign. This is a very bizarre, unusual aspect. The journal Stile, I already mentioned, published a monthly column entitled La Cucina di Guerra. This war cookbook offered recipes that were fully based on the use of autarkic products. Farina di fecola autarchica, for instance, which was used to make salted biscuits that could well replace bread. In an article, close to this, titled Giardino in Tempi Difficili, the author wrote, I quote, "We need to face the present difficult condition. This year, instead of flowers, we'll make sure that our gardens will produce non-stop vegetable baskets," end quote. A garden for every home and family, this notion of a self-sufficient kitchen garden was implicit in one of the many articles Ponti wrote, fully acknowledging the advantages of the family economy. Even though he illustrates his text with English and German examples, the propaganda interpreted the idea of the war gardens all'italiana. I hope you will recognize the harvesting in Piazza del Popolo with the obelisk and the churches. And this is the University of Rome. Now that the university was almost closed, why not use for war gardens? Pagano on the backside. However, this masking of reality soon became no more than a futile exercise. The year 1942 marked a crucial turning point. It may well serve as a synecdoche of the period between autarky and post-World War II reconstruction. The year began with full hopes. Defeat could be avoided, the war would end with a compromise. Illusion and renunciation could still be a shared sentiment. In October, the scenario turned to the worst. Cities were heavily bombed. 1942 was the year when Domus introduced the program La Casa e l'Ideale, the home, an ideal vision. Between August 42 and May 43, the same range of date of the Roma Città Aperta, Domus published 13 articles in this series and 20 projects as a whole. The magazine invited architects to present projects of their ideal home, their private dreams of living. Commenting on the forced inactivity of the year, the editor claimed that Italy was facing, quote, an odd period of idleness, but one that might also potentially be fruitful in offering chance to reflect on an ideal way of living. Each word of the introductory text seems to mask the reality of the war, while simultaneously echoing its drama and its effects on everyone's morality. I quote, "Who can repress our wishes? It is a necessity that we express our desires at all cost. Free dreams will offer the foundation of ideas for tomorrow, or tomorrow that is already today." This project embodied the most urgent priority, the house for everybody, end quote. Thus, this exercise in fantasy was conceived as a useful means to explore ideas about future dwelling and create new possibility for all human beings. I quote again, however, this engagement with the ideal may ended up in being an escape from reality. The critic may forcefully condemn the aesthetic rationalism of this project, but the truth is that the architects had finally freed themselves from the ties of the present culture, academic in its outdated taste. Their primary concerns are now served from that defeatist culture. Instead, they are better addressed to safe culture. It is a lesson for everybody. This project shows a direction, end quote. Who among the architects answered that reviews call for an imaginary vision of the modern dwelling? Most of the names are well known in this kind of encyclopedia of name or prospect. Banfi, Beressutti, Belgioioso, Zanuso, Coccia, Bianchetti, we have seen him yesterday in Pep's paper twice, Mollino, Cattaneo, to cite a few. Domus gave them a forum for expressing their dreams and hopes. It allowed them to create a kind of Esperanto that would eventually help them to transfer the iconic rationalism of the 30s into the cultivated modern vernacular of post-war reconstruction. Even more, the architect used the program as a way to move beyond pragmatic solution and to elaborate some radical alternative invention that displayed a rich repertoire of materials and technologies that might be considered a visionary, that's one example, Belgioioso, a visionary high-tech avant la lettre. This is 42. It is worth noticing, and not commenting all of that, that in the majority of the projects, the landscape was a component of the ideal dwelling. It is as if the architects were seeking to move away from the bombed cities to an ideal countryside. Conversely, however, nature and solitude also became a means by which the most intimate thoughts might be expressed without masking. And I'm just showing some of these projects. This is Banfi moving a house that can later be something originated in the landscape of much later. Again, Zanuso. Here the Mediterranean myth is very clear. The beach, La Casa, the countryside. Bianchetti, that's the architect, with Le Corbusier in 37 in Paris. Even one of the few examples that doesn't take the countryside as a counterpart, but the city, Mollino, even from Mollino, he calls his house trunk home. Turin can be perceived as a distant reality. You see, it's very far. This is another few example, or one of the examples. It is interesting to compare these ideal dwellings, these embodiments of utopian dreams, with the buildings published in the special issue of Edilizia Moderna, April-December 42, same year, entitled Costruzioni al tempo di guerra, del tempo di guerra, buildings during wartime. Oh, this is a very bizarre, a project of the ideal house by Cattaneo, which was in fact issued under the pressure of the magazine, the Catholic magazine Famiglia Cristiana. And it's a house that becomes bigger and bigger as the family enlarges. All this. This is Edilizia Moderna. The striking contrast captures some of the ambiguities that the architectural profession was confronting. Giuseppe Luraghi, the editor of Edilizia Moderna, is de facto unknown in the professional literature. His short introduction sounds today like an extreme defense of the regime past grandiosity. I quote, "The war has dictated a rigid discipline in the field of building. Edilizia Moderna aims to offer a witness of that nobility that will guide our future. Still, we feel we'll be victorious. These buildings represent the vitality of our country, still undefeated by the tough struggle of the wartime." End quote. Pagano, the front page, Piacentini, and then Muzio, Scoccimarro are among the architect's name. This is Scoccimarro, and you see always the advertising of the autarkic products. This is the Italian linoleum. Those are the buildings. Bocconi University, the Palace of Justice, the headquarters of the newspaper Popolo d'Italia, you have seen just before, and here the headquarters of the Banca of Rome are among the examples of fascist institutional buildings included in this issue. Here, that's the last one of the Edilizia Moderna. Here, the agony of the regime is in the background. The buildings are presented to demonstrate technical skill. The result, going through the pages, is a dull functionalism. A final topic that I would like to discuss, if briefly, involves another way of living the war, if from a distance, that is, as a prisoner of war. It is a difficult subject because some of the architects I alluded, Banfi for instance, to earlier, died in concentration camps, Pagano. However, in this context, the years Ludovico Quaroni spent in India are relevant and have been rarely addressed. In 1941, Quaroni was caught in Albania by British troops and sent to a camp in India until the end of the conflict. Quaroni was born in 1911, graduated from the School of Architecture in Rome in 1934. Then his professional life started under fascism, and he participated in some of the major competitions, including those for the E-42. After World War II, he played a prominent role as one of the protagonists of post-war reconstruction and collaborated closely both as a designer and intellectual figure with Adriano Olivetti. Historians have frequently introduced the notion of continuity as a key concept to explain Italian architectural culture before and post-World War II. Quaroni's contribution, however, requires a more complex reading. I'll show you from his carnet. The years he lived in India brought a distance from Italian circumstances, one that became strength after he returned to Italy. He learned from his experience in India and from the people he met there. Quaroni's Indian carnet contains a plenitude of sketches that show how consistent, for instance, his interest was in the modern dwelling. His drawings from a place so far away offer another vision of the ideal home. The strong forms, as you see in these images, carry echoes of elements, for instance, of international style. But Quaroni's accurate observation of Indian vernacular architecture are also worth mentioning. His vivid images of Indian dwellings and domestic vernacular testify an almost anthropological interest in native culture that has left many traces in his following projects. Could his experience in India have partly inspired his village-like Tiburtino neighborhood of early 50s in Rome? It is worth exploring this more distant resonance. In this brief survey of images and issues, I have tried to show several possible fields of research, leaving many questions open rather than attempting to trace definitive conclusions. One last final remark. During the war years, the realism of the artists, such as Guttuso, appears to have produced a more trenchant critique of the Italian conflict than the images of the architects. And I would think that this relationship, art-architecture, is a major topic. And this is Guttuso's Crocefissione, his interpretation, 41, maybe of Guernica. Undoubtedly, the pendulum that swung between desire of the new and a nostalgia for less troubled past led to the deep contradiction in architecture. By its end, fascism had caused death, fear, and migration. However, it was pivotal in forging the Rinascita. And here we have the USA and Guttuso, Boogie Woogie, 1945. Thanks a lot.